Welcome to Zoo Tours, the channel that brings the zoo right to you. And if this is your first tour, then hit those like and subscribe buttons, along with that bell icon to officially join the zoo crew. And before we begin, see if you can answer this episode's trivia question. Every zoo in the world has at least one eye-opening feature that drives a guest to visit over and over again. St. Louis has a lot of those. Part of it is their free admission, but it's also their unique exhibit styles, undisputed collection of rarities, and their preservation of the past. For this episode, we're headed to the historic hill to talk about their troops of primates, just one of the ways they keep their history alive, and the zoo's most recent addition. But before we leap like a lemur into the new, I think it's best if we begin with the old. The Primate House. This heavily inspired Spanish-style building opened way back in 1925, and if you compare this footage to vintage photos, much of it hasn't aged a day. The first thing that always catches my eye are the many columns that frames a central garden. Looks like a perfect place to put a primate, right? Well, as opposed to the similar central gardens in the herpetarium full of giant turtles and the birdhouses full of free-flying birds, there are not any animals in here. It's surrounded by 13 glass-fronted enclosures, all with rocky outcroppings that replaced the original cages in 1977, and I'm willing to bet they haven't changed much since. Once upon a time, and by that I mean not even a year ago, the building was packed full of primates looking at each other through either side of the glass. But on my last visit, with a couple of exceptions, it was practically empty, and the signs actually encouraged you to get out, go outside, and see what's new. Now, it may not be empty in the winter, but what I'm about to show you really shows the zoo has in some big way moved on from the past. Most of these animals didn't have outdoor access, and the few who did weren't exactly living in paradise. So the zoo bulldozed these small, uninspiring cages and replaced them with something the nation has never seen before. The Primate Canopy Trails just opened in July of 2021. From one visit, I could see that it was a huge success for both its animals and their visitors. Instead of a few cages along the side of the building, accessible only to a few species, there are now 8 mesh enclosures spread out in a 35,000 square foot space, accessible to approximately 40 primates from 14 species. And they're all connected in some way by these flexible overhead tunnels to make 70 different combinations in the rotation. So you have no clue what and where you're going to see on your visit. Obviously, this design was inspired by the Philadelphia Zoo, but I don't think there's an exhibit out there that's gone to these lengths. There are 3 ways you can enter, but we'll start from the Primate House's exit. The first 2 new homes that are just outside of the door, I assume only display the smaller critters. It was a little quiet over here, but I did eventually see a mongoose lemur on the right, but their much smaller neighbors, the cotton-top tamarins and Goldie's marmosets, chose to stay inside and avoid the heat. Going along the trail's far right side, I have never seen such wild behavior from 2 of the 16 kinds of langurs, or langurs if you want to be fancy, leaf monkey if you don't. For as long as I've come around here, it's always been this same combo with this group. Francois leaf monkeys of Vietnam and southern China. Endangered, though I've come across them many times on my trips. Then there's the spectacled leaf monkey of Thailand through the Malaysian peninsula. They are also endangered, but are far from common in the States. St. Louis is the only zoo where I've had the pleasure of watching their acrobatics, but there are at the very most 4 other places in the US where you can find them. Langur is a name of Hindi origin, meaning having a tail, and their tail is 30% longer than the rest of their body. It isn't prehensile, so they use it for balance when they're moving around like this. Next to all this noise is what I thought depicted deforestation, an undergrown forest. But it's actually the edible forest where the zoo publicly grows leafy snacks for the primates to play with and to obviously eat. I read that this next animal needs this certain plant every single day. Unfortunately, they were not in the 4th space, Sort of. Their tunnel led to the new indoor holding, and the cockerel sheepfocas decided to stay in the air doing what they do best. Most other primates prefer to jump using all fours, as you just saw. Sheepfocas prefer the two-legged sideways hop to get around. They were trying to get into the new Primate Care Center, a secondary holding where even you can peek in and see where the meals are prepped in several of their indoor quarters. Now it's time to head into the section that lets you meet them in the trees, the Majestic Forest. The first of these three really futuristic looking displays that are capped off with a circular roof. They're very reminiscent of the Cleveland Museum's new Wildlife Center, and this day it contained their black-handed spider monkeys. In the heart of this not-so-dense forest, but still a forest nonetheless, was their troop of colobus monkeys, getting their fair share of people watching in the conservation canopy. And based on the swarm of visitors, they seemed to be the guest favorite, and it might have had something to do with baby Juniper, who was born this April. She was the 10th successful colobus birth in the last 10 years, and because of this expansion, the zoo can also expand on their breeding programs for every other species as well. An elevated path like this is nothing new, but there's something different about it. You can nearly encircle the animals, and I've never felt this close to a primate when I was off the ground. And you don't just get to experience what their lives are like at this height, but I've also never been to a zoo that shows why the canopy is so important to a primate. There's signage that tells you it's where they get their food, where they can seek shelter from unwelcoming weather, and where they go to hide and remain undetected from predators. The third of the three circular roofed enclosures is the Sycamore Sanctuary with Allen's swamp monkeys. The zoo reports that they just insist on pulling as many plants out as possible, but I hear the horticulture team doesn't mind regularly doing a lot of replanting. And finally, coming around the bend is the Primate Panorama, the very first thing you'll see or the very last depending on where you come in. It's about as unique of an exhibit as the Canopy Trails is as an attraction. The animals can be on your right, your left, and jumping right above you all at the same time. It's like a shark tunnel for leaping primates. And this exact habitat's rendering was heavily used in promotions, depicting a wild scenario with sheepfocas moving around in every direction. I did in fact see lemurs, but they weren't exactly going wild. But this space could be empty, and I would still be mesmerized by the design. Now we're not exactly done. When you've gone through this primate jungle, you can reach the treetops in a different way. With a jungle gym, I've been talking about tunnels this whole time, but I have to mention that the best and the last one is saved for us. By the conservation canopy, there's a crawl-through tunnel that not only puts you above the other visitors, but it goes through the top of the Primate Panorama. And that concludes this episode of the Primate Canopy Trails, a positively chaotic attraction that set out to encourage people of all ages to understand a primate's life in the trees, a primate's need for fresh living situations, and why a healthy canopy is important to all sorts of wildlife. Honestly, I don't see it winning any awards, but I do see other zoos following its design and message. As always, let me know your thoughts, and next time we're back in St. Louis, we'll be staying back in time to explore one of the historic hill's other historic sites.